Hi there, how are you today? Good. Obviously, my voice is not good today. I apologize for that. I think we'll probably have to have a slightly shorter class, most likely. We'll struggle through a few little bits and pieces, but there was some stuff I just wanted to make sure that we talked about before we miss next week because of spring break, so you'd have some of this information to work with as you go on to the next, finish up this current lab and go on to the next one. Right? Before we dig in, were there any questions I could answer before we get started? While I take a sip of coffee. Okay, so we got started with controllers last time. Basically, what did we find out? Controllers, of course, are the C and MVC. They're the glue that holds the model and the views together. Basic responsibility of a controller is that it accepts input from the user. It then, based on that input, typically carries out some sort of data manipulation, working with active record most of the time. It then is responsible for formulating some sort of response to go back to the user again, right? So what we've done so far in our controllers example here is we've created an item controller and given it a few actions, the methods inside the item controller. The first of those actions is a method called index. And what index's job was supposed to be is that whenever it's requested, it should show the user a list of all items. So we set up the index action so that when it runs, it retrieves all the items from active record and stores them in an instance variable called @items. We put them into an instance variable because instance variables that are created in the controller will automatically be available, will automatically be in scope in the view. Right? So whenever somebody requests index, we end up with this relation of items. Right? We then, of course, are going to render the index template, right? Which then takes the items and displays them. So in the browser, when we go to items/index, we end up with the output being sent back to us, which is the rendered index template, which is rendered using the data that the controller provided to it. In that index template, we created a link for each one of our items, where the link text is the item's name, and we set up that link so that it would go to a show action and it would pass the item's ID. Right? So in this case, when the user clicks on a link, the link itself is going to carry some information to the controller. It's going to take the ID of the item that we want to see information about. Right? So over in the controller, we're then able to access that ID through a params hash that Rails puts together for us automatically. Any values that are passed as part of a URL, any values that are passed as part of a form submission are automatically put into this params hash for us to use. So when the user clicks a link, an ID gets passed here to the show action. The show action can find out the ID for the item they clicked on. We can then use that ID to find one particular item, which we then put into a instance variable, and we render the show template, which uses that instance variable to show information about that specific item. So if I click on one of my items, it takes me over to the show page. You can see in the URL the ID that was put in there, and I see data about that particular item. When I clicked on can of beans, I see the information about can of beans. When I click on spoon, I see the information about spoon. Yeah, not intuitive. Do you have questions about that part? Can you hear me at all? Okay, just checking. All right, let's see. So when we requested the index action, right, and we gathered up the items to be shown, how did Rails know to render the index template? Well, the answer is magic. It's kind of one of those built-in defaults inside Rails that when you request an action, unless Rails is told otherwise, it will always look for a template whose name matches the name of that action. So we go to the index action. That means we're going to show the index template as our response. When we go to the show action, we're going to show the show template as the response. That's always going to be the case unless we specifically in the controller tell it otherwise. If we run into a situation where we want one action to use a different view, a different template, or vice versa, right, then we just have to be specific about it, is really all it comes down to. Right? So for example, let's say in our controller we add a new action called view. If view's job is to essentially do the same thing that show is supposed to do, say view is going to be passed an ID for an item, then the view action would need to find that particular item, put it in an instance variable to use. Okay. If we go and actually try to access that view, though, we're going to run into a couple of problems. If I come over in my browser, I go to items/view, maybe I'll manually pass it ID 1. Very first problem I get is I have a routing error. We haven't talked about the Rails router yet, but it's something we're going to be continuously brushing up against more and more frequently, so it won't be too much longer before we do dig in and talk about it. Right. For right now, essentially, if we want this route to work, what we basically need to do is in our routes file, we need to put in something very much like what it gives right here in the error message. So if I even want to be able to get to the view action at all, I'll go over to my routes file, and in the same basic style as everything else that's in there, I'm going to say get items/view, essentially just so that Rails is aware that that is a thing that can be reached. With that little bit in there, back to the browser, refresh. It doesn't have a routing problem anymore, but now it's complaining about our lack of a template. At the moment, Rails is doing its default behavior, which is that if we go to a view action, it expects there to be a template file, a view file called view. So essentially it's looking over here under the items folder for a file called view.html.erb, which doesn't exist. And that's what it's upset about. That's why we have the error message. Well, there's basically two ways out of this. One of them is that we could create the file it's looking for. We could create the view file, view.html.erb, and then everything would be happy. But what if the view page was essentially supposed to be exactly the same as the show page? Well, I don't really want to duplicate that code. Why don't I just tell the view action to use the show template? Right? So essentially it would be the first time when we've had an action that uses a template by a different name, something other than the default template. And it's actually very easy to do. All we have to do is use our good old buddy, the render method. Same render method that we were using, I guess it was last week, in the views themselves to render things like partials. The render method can also be used from inside the controller to specifically tell an action which view file, which template file it should render. Right? If I go give that a try, hey, look at that, it works. The URL makes it look like we've gone to a page called view, right? But how that view, how that response is actually being generated is by making use of our show page. Right? So in a way, almost another form of reusing templates, kind of like a bigger scale partial in a way. Right? What's actually happening here when we call render? Right? A lot of people tend to think of render as being something kind of like a method call or a redirect. Right? Often people think if we say render show, that means that we're coming up here and we're executing the show action. But that's not the case. You'll notice that if I take out the line here where I'm retrieving the item and try to access view, I get an error saying that we're trying to access the name method for nil. So basically item is never getting assigned. If render was actually redirecting in some way up here to show, then show would take care of going ahead and getting the item, and that's obviously not happening. Right? Really what happens when we call render, right, at the end of an action is we're not calling another action, we're simply telling it the name of a file to use. So saying render show is kind of like saying use the file called show.html.erb is really kind of what it comes down to. Does that make sense? Okay. So render is not redirecting, but doing redirections are possible. We certainly can redirect to a different action if we happen to need to. One of the places where that's most often done is when we're doing things like creating a new entry of some sort. So let's set up our new page so that we can get ourselves in a situation where redirection would become appropriate. All right. So what I want to do is I want to have a new page. I actually already have the template file started for it. The generator that we ran last time kind of gave us the little stub for it. Let me just start filling it out here. You remember when we were talking about form helpers, that it'd be pretty quick and easy to get a form put together for creating a new item. I could start off by saying this is a form for an item. Something like that. Inside the form, I'm going to ask it to create a label for the name field. I'll ask it to create a text field. Text field for the name field. Same basic thing for speed then. And a submit button. Oh, I just remembered we're going to have a problem there with that. Up here where we have form for at item, that requires a slightly more sophisticated set of routes than what we actually have right now. So instead I'm going to use a different form where I basically tell it the route. Essentially I'm going to say this is a form for an item. Then I'm going to tell it the URL to actually submit to is that I want it to submit to an action called create. That doesn't look right. Text field is underscored, isn't it? There we go. Yeah, that does look better. Alright. Let's see. Let me go back over to my index page, I guess. Let me put in a hyperlink to get to the new page. Let's just say go to action new. Go back to my index page. Oh, link to, yeah. There we go. Got my new item link. I click the new item link. It takes me over to the new page, but the new page is showing a routing error. Again, what's going on there is that over on the new page, I've specified a route. Basically, I've told it to go to a create action. That action doesn't exist, nor does a route for it exist, so I need to create the route. So back over in my routes file, I'm going to say post items create. There we go. It's a weird looking button. Huh. Look at the shape of the button. Normal, weird, normal, depending on the zoom level. There's a zoom level, I think it's about 150% in there. It doesn't render the button right. Peculiar. Oh well, one way or another. Right? So anyway, we got our form to actually show up. Okay? The form, though, doesn't exactly have everything it needs. Over in the actual new action in our controller, the form generally is going to be, the controller is generally going to be expected to provide the form with a empty, blank object of the type that's being created. So in this case, what I want to do is go ahead and create a default item. So I'll just say item.new. We don't need to save it. We just need to have that item available for the form to use, to refer to. Okay. And there we go. The form itself right now is set up so that it is going to submit to the URL /item/create. So when I actually fill out the form and hit submit, what's going to happen is we're going to end up back over in the controller, and the controller is going to expect, or we're going to expect the controller to respond to a create action. So we need to add that. So into my controller, I'll put in create right here. Until we get a handle on just what create is, let's just tell create to show us the text that's in the params array whenever it's called, just so we can see what is being submitted to the create action. All of a sudden I went back and wrote that the old-fashioned way, didn't I? Let's try it that way, just to try to be consistent. So now over in my browser, if I put in an item called life whose speed is fast, and I submit it, this is what is actually being passed to the create action. Basically, it's given a hash, big hash, that has some default data in it, a little UTF mark there. Helps with making the behavior of forms more consistent across all browsers. There's an authenticity token in there, which Rails can use to figure out if it's really a valid form that's being submitted or not. And then this is the part that's important to us, right here. Where does it end? Oh, actually it's just this bit right here. Embedded inside that overall hash that was passed to create, there's a sub-hash in there called item, has the same name as what's being created, and inside that sub-hash is the actual values that were submitted from the form. So when I told it to create an item whose name is life and whose speed is fast, that's what's in that sub-hash. If I go back to that form again and tell it that I want to create a new item called coffee whose speed is very fast, when I submit in that sub-hash, I have an item coffee speed very fast. So this is the data that's actually being submitted to create. So that's essentially the data that we have to work with here inside the create action. If we work with params item, params element item, key item, whatever you want to call that, okay, essentially what we have at that point is we just have a little hash that has in it the values for the new object that's supposed to be created. Yeah? And you remember when we were creating new items in the console? When we were working with Active Record to make new items? This is one of the forms, passing the attributes that we wanted to go into the new Active Record object as a hash was one of the ways that we could create something new. So what we can actually do here in create is, instead of rendering those params as text, we could instead go ahead and say create a new item, like that. Say @item equals item.new, and I'll pass it the item hash that's inside the params. That makes sense? Well, let's go see what happens if we give that a try. I'm going to go back to the new page again. I'll tell it I want to create a new item called table, whose speed is very, very slow. I'll hit save item, and I end up getting an error. The error I'm getting in this case is telling me that there's a missing template. Essentially, again, Rails is trying to do its default behavior. It executed the create action, and since it wasn't told otherwise, what it's trying to do is it's trying to render a template called create, and we don't have a template called create. So this is a situation where I don't even probably necessarily want to create a template called create. I don't want there to be one. Instead, create is essentially just there to do a job, and once that job is actually done, I want to just redirect somewhere else. Okay? So let's look at one more thing here real quick. If I go back to the index page, you see that my table was not actually created. No table. It's not that we didn't execute create. It's not that this line didn't succeed. The problem was that we never saved it. Since I did .new, the object that resulted needed to be saved. So I needed to do .item.save in order to get that object to actually be created. Okay. But there's also, of course, the possibility of what if the item can't be created. Save might return true, might return false, depending on whether the object is valid and can be saved, or is invalid and can't be saved. So I might want to say in create, not just save, I might want to say if save was successful. Right? And then I could tell it what to do if it is and what to do if it isn't. I suppose it would probably make sense to go over to my model, my item model, and put in a validation so it is possible to have a saving of an item fail. Over in my item model, how about if I say validates name presence true, so we can't leave the name blank. And I might as well go ahead and do speed too, huh? Validates name and speed for presence. Okay, so now it's possible that it may not be saved. So in our create action, what do we want to do if it's not valid? What do you normally do in a web app if somebody submits a form and the data is invalid? And you leave them sitting there staring at the form, right? Usually you want them to see an error message right there on the form itself, right? And to have the data there in it so that they can then correct their error and try again. That's a perfect situation for render. Essentially, we don't want to go and execute the new action again, because that would destroy the item that they just attempted to create. So all the input that they've made so far, valid or not, would be lost. So what we could do instead is, instead of saying go back to the new action, we could just say go and render the new page, the new template. and we don't really have the new template set up to show errors. We could go back and do that fairly easily if we wanted to, but we could still give it a try. If I go to create a new item, I hit save item without filling in any data, I end up just sitting here at the new page still. And did you notice the spacing in there change? You know, Rails was putting in that field with errors information, so a little bit of CSS in those fields would start being highlighted as errors. Okay. So that little bit seems to be working. If you think about how it's actually working, it's kind of interesting. When the user first goes to the new page, we're of course fundamentally rendering this form, which needs a variable called @item. Where does this page originally get that? Well, it gets it from this line in the new action. When we submit the form, though, if the value is invalid, if the object is invalid and can't be saved, and we say render new, when that new form is rendered again, it still needs @item, but this time it's using this item, the item that we attempted to create using the values from the user. Which is why if I do something like put in incomplete information and submit, that incomplete information comes right back. Because originally when we go to the form fresh, it's using a blank item for the form. But if we re-render the new page because of a validation problem, because of a problem saving, the item that's used to fill the form in that case is the one that's partially correct based on their last input. So new and create both use the new template. New and create both provide an item. New's item is always blank. Create's item will probably be partially filled. Does that make sense? Good. Now what happens with create if we do successfully save the object? Well, in that case, we don't want to leave them sitting there looking at the new page. They're done with it. They've successfully created a new item. What we most likely want to do at that point is we want to redirect them off to some other page. Depending on where we redirect them, there's different ways we might do this, but the easiest way is that Rails provides a method in the controller called redirect to. The redirect to method needs to be given some sort of path, told where to redirect to. When we get into our routes and we can come up with some fancier ways of doing it, this can be shortened, but what we can do for right now is we could say something like redirect to the show action, for example. The show action then also requires an ID, so how about I just say take the ID from the item that was just saved. So essentially, if we successfully create a new item, we'll go to the show page and show the user that item. If I go give that a shot, if I try to create my thing whose speed is medium, if I hit save item, I end up over at the show page showing my thing with medium speed. If I get back to my index page, yeah, there's the thing as medium. So I guess maybe we could say 3 possible outcomes, 3 possible ways that a controller action may decide or be told what to show or what to do after it's carried out its basic data work. There's always the default that with a controller action, if we don't say otherwise, like up here with index or with show, that it will simply look for a template with the proper name that matches that action, and that's what will be rendered. There's also then the possibility, like with view or with one of the possible outcomes of create, where we might tell a controller action to use a different actions template. In the case of view, we told it to use the show action template. In the case of create and a failed save, we told it to use the new actions template. Third possibility then is that we might have an action just completely redirect to a different action. Unlike render, where we're just borrowing a template to show, when we say redirect to something, we actually go and execute that something. So this redirect to show for the ID of item is kind of like clicking a hyperlink that takes us back up here and executes the show action itself, which is why we had to provide the ID, so that it would be there up here and show when it needed to use that in order to find the item to then feed to its template to show. It's only extremely complicated, right? That's all. Do you have questions? All right, let me tell you one last thing, kind of a cool little thing, and then we'll probably stop for today. You probably remember from previous web development languages the concept of sessions. A session basically writes out some kind of unique ID and a cookie to the user's computer, which is then sent in with every request, so that user can then be matched up with a server-side data store, so we can store data for that user and be able to identify them as they go from page to page, request after request. Rails has sessions. They're enabled by default. They're simply always there. You just use them if you want to use them. In Rails, sessions take the form of a hash. So anywhere in a controller, anywhere in a template, a view, that you want to use sessions, just refer to the sessions hash. That's all there is to it. Overall, sessions are of course useful, but they're pretty wide open in what you can do with them. Right? You know a session, you know you need a session when you need it, that kind of thing. Okay? One of my favorite things always to do with sessions, though, is to do quick, short-lived interpage communications. In a situation where, for example, one action executes, and as a result of that action executing, I want to show a message on the very next page the user gets to, and then after that, I want that message to go away. I wrote a little thing like that to use back in PHP class called Flash. Right? The whole idea with those Flash messages that we did back in PHP is from Rails. That's exactly how Rails does it, and it has the ability to send these Flash messages from page to page automatically. Right? Essentially, anytime we want to send a Flash message, there is a Flash hash. So maybe whenever the user successfully creates a new item, I want to create a new Flash message. I'm going to say it's a message called notice. Before I redirect to show, I'll say set Flash notice equal to the item was created. Over on the show page then, I could do something like say if Flash notice, if we have a Flash notice waiting, well, then maybe what we'll do is we'll just display it. So now if I go and I create a new item, I'll say create test 1, speed test 1, save. When I get to the show page up at the top, it says the item was created. If I hit refresh, notice the Flash message disappears. If I go back over to my index page, which needs to be spelled correctly, and I go to the show page for a different item, like for spoon, the flash message doesn't show up. Rails basically handles for us automatically clearing out this flash hash. The flash hash is always available. Rails automatically makes it available to us. Right? And what it does is it stores messages there until they're accessed. Once you access something, like we're accessing the value of the flash right here, Rails automatically expires that value, takes it out of the hash, so we don't have to worry about it. So anytime we just want to be able to send a quick little message from one page to another, it's just a matter of putting that message into the flash hash, right? And you can make up the names for it over here. A lot of times I'll use things like notice, info, or error are the three I use most often. Info is kind of, to me, the lowest priority, just, in case you're wondering, this is something. Notice is, hey, you need to know about this, but it's not necessarily a disaster. And then error is something I put in when something's gone really wrong. Right? But you basically just put the message into the flash, and then anywhere you want to show it, you just show it. Right? Rails handles setting up the flash hash, it handles maintaining it, you just use it. Very handy. Okay. There's even a shortcut we can use. Right? Instead of writing it out longhand like that, when we do a redirect to, we should be able to put the URL part of the arguments in as a hash, and then after that, we ought to be able to just put in our flash message right there. So if I say redirect to, first argument as a hash, I tell it where we're redirecting to, and then as a second argument, I tell it the name, the key in the flash hash to use and the message to store. Let's see if that works. You go to the new page. Uh-oh. Nope, it didn't like it. I was worried about the syntax of it because typically when I use this, I'm not doing this more old school form of providing a URL. I wonder what form it actually wants it in. Yeah, took out the curly braces. It seems happy with that for the moment. See if that actually works or not. Doesn't make sense. I bet that's not going to work. Yeah, give it a try. Test 2, test 2. Yeah, the message never actually showed up. Ah, well, we'll be able to use something a little bit more like that later. For now, I'm just going to comment out that bit, and we'll just stick to the old school way. I guess when we're using old school paths, we need to stick to the old school way of doing the flash. But once we get our routes a bit more under control and we can start using some nice routing methods to do things like redirect, then we'll be able to use that fancier form of the flash where we can get it all done in just a single line. Okay? I think that's probably a good spot for us to stop today. Can I answer any questions for you? Next week's spring break. No class next week. When we come back, what I want to do is start a new example. Still kind of ignoring routes for the moment. We'll just kind of throw in one standard routing line, and then I want to more or less go through the process of building up an entire CRUD system where we create the active record model, we create the entire controller, we create all the views, get the entire stack, everything all put together. Once we can do that, we'll be able to play with routes a bit, and then that's it. We're masters of the universe. We can do anything. All right. Sorry about the late class and the lack of volume today. I hope you have a good spring break. Hope you enjoy the time off. Time off for me anyway.